How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul longs, indeed it faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God. Amen. Okay, I can't help but make sure we know when we read that word host, which showed up in the Psalms, that you know that that's a military unit designation akin to a legion. So when we talk about the Lord of hosts, it's really like the equivalent of saying Lord of battalions, Lord of legions. It's sort of a number of, it's an army conscript language, if that makes sense. We don't always hear that, right? But a host is like basically 2,000 troops. Most people don't know that a legion is also like 2,000 troops, not 1,000. We don't always use that transparently, but that's when you hear hosts, and especially heavenly host, that's talking about like supernatural soldiers. That can make me uncomfortable because I don't love military language, but keep in mind, there is such thing as the Army Corps of Engineers, and their job is to like help civilians. So heavenly hosts could be the Corps of Engineers that are supernatural.
Hey, Mike.
Yes, sir.
How did the Eucharist become the host?
I don't know the answer to that. I used to know. Sorry. I mean, I could guess, but it would just be me guessing, Tim. And it is worth saying that there's words we use interchangeably, like some people call it the Eucharist and some people call it the Mass. And I want to be clear that we read about sacred vestments. And I'm not saying this concern is baseless, but I did have somebody concerned after Halloween, All Hallows Eve, when I did not wear the sacred vestments in the sanctuary because I chose to wear garb that Martin Luther himself most likely would have worn on Reformation Day. But this is where it's interesting to have this conversation about what sanctuary is then and now. We don't have sacred vestments in the Episcopal Church. We just have vestments. That is to say, they're clothes, and they're expensive clothes, and they point us to a reality deeper than themselves. But if I spill wax on them, I haven't desecrated something. I hope that makes sense, what I'm saying. Like, the garments are not sacred in our church. These garments were sacred. So if you mess with them, there's like a heck of a price to pay. And this is part of a little bit of the difference, right? I didn't consecrate the chasuble. I wear it. I didn't consecrate the alb that I wear. I just wear that. The Lord's table was consecrated. The space was consecrated.
Is that true in Catholic churches?
I'm not sure that it is. I think in Catholic churches, the garments, the vestments might be sacred vestments.
I'm not sure either.
But I don't know for sure, Graciela, whether or not like a bishop has to bless chasubles. I don't know the answer to that. And so like, I think they represent sacrality for people, and that's fine. That's what symbols do. But that doesn't mean that they've been identified as like holy objects. Right. And this is where it's like a little bit loose to think about. And I hope this way of thinking is not interfering with our reading. To me, it's tangential and connecting and important. But let me back out on that because John's got his hand up.
Oh, Mike, what do you wear on your left wrist?
That's called a maniple. The maniple is an old thing. It basically started out as a napkin, and it's in case people like, get crumbs or get like wine on their mouth, because they shouldn't wipe that off. That would be in some ways not like respecting the sacrality of the wine. But that maniple is like $300. So I will not be wiping your mouth with it. It started out functional and then became symbolic. And really what it represents is like a butler with a towel on their arm. It just happens to be a darn expensive towel. right? So you go from function to like representation with a lot of what we got going on. And I don't want to like overdo this, but a lot of people don't realize the vestments we wear in church, they didn't come out of the Hebrew Bible. They came out of the Roman nobility. This is how regular people dressed at the time. It's not like somebody said, let's go back to Leviticus. I don't wear an ephod. No priest wears an ephod. That's like a chest piece that's encrusted with gems. And I don't know if you noticed, it has lots in it, which are basically dice. And so in a time when you're trying to discern God's will, you roll the dice. And it's sort of like, come on, boxcars, you know. I'm not even kidding. Like, that's the way you did it, because the understanding was games of chance were governed by God. And when we read this, there's like regular shrines have ephods with lots in them. And then there's like the lots of lots. Those are called the Urim and Thummim, which is sort of like the biggest magic 8-ball in the land. And not everybody makes this connection, but after Judas, the disciple, kills himself, they want another disciple. And they've got 2 candidates. And they don't conduct interviews, they roll the dice. And they say, like, God, or I mean, when there's only 2, you flip a coin, but this is like lot rolling. God, if it's heads, it's Barabbas, and if it's tails, it's Mattathias. So here's the flip, and you make it come out like you want. Let me open the floor, though, to your questions and comments from either the video or the reading, and I'm more than happy to go backward, as always, you know, whatever suits us here.
Well, the thing that I was curious about in the video is whenever the guy said, he quoted Paul as saying that we will join with God in heaven, but I thought it was the other way around. He's coming down to join us.
We get both images when we read the scriptures, right? People being caught up, but it's helpful to remember that the concept of heaven, like with angels and harps and forever, is far into the Bible. It's just not anywhere in the Bible. Heaven and eternal life are actually like code speak for larger life. I mean, there just wasn't a concept of infinity. That's not a Hebrew idea. Hebrew understanding, right, is that there are these cycles to the year. Now, they do go somewhere. So you notice how my finger's moving? The Greek idea is that time is an arrow, and the Eastern idea is time's a wheel. And when you put those together, you get like a coil, right? So it's going somewhere, but there's rhythms to the year, the seasons. And it turns out, right, that the Hebrew festivals are in fact oriented around seasons. Like, you have to have Passover in the spring. And if you only stuck to the lunar calendar, Passover would do like Ramadan. It could be any time in the year. So once Passover starts to get close to summer, what our Jewish brothers and sisters do is they add a 13th lunar month to push it backward. And that's because if it fell out of that seasonal rhythm, it wouldn't serve like the rhythmic purpose of the festival. You can't have Passover during the winter because there's no harvest. I don't know if that makes sense. I got a nice email from Julia with some questions, and maybe I can just offer one from her and see kind of what you think about any of these. One of these is, I can't help but think that the offerings were a bit of a bloody mess. I can appreciate the intricacy and detail that was put into them, but the visual is hard for me to see as holy. You shall slaughter the ram and take its blood and throw it against the altar round about. I know different time and place and connotations, but I'm glad this is not a practice we do today. And by the way, I am too. And it's maybe helpful to know in terms of like flinging blood on folk. we hear that that's like the prescription, but we're not sure if that was ever done. This is going to sound really strange to you, right? But we've got the scriptures, but we don't have any kind of like record of whether they were followed. By how many? It's really clear when Solomon kills like 1,000 oxen a day, that's not even possible. There's like some code speak in that, because not only would you exhaust the supply of cattle in the land like real fast, but just the detritus of blood and bones would just, I mean, Herb has been to the city of David along with John and Ellen. It's small. I mean, it's like 4 city blocks. It's tiny. Where are you going to put all that stuff? It's not like some cosmopolitan big old city, right? It's tiny. So where's all that go? So the scale that we get has to be symbolic. I don't want to say it's over exaggerated. It has to be symbolic. And, you know, when you think about things like blood, we could take it. I'm not saying there wasn't any literal practice, but it is helpful to think about that blood represents the life of the animal, right? And that's in some ways as symbolic as it is literal. I am also glad that we don't do this. And in general, the blood sprinkling happens like when you consecrate things. You know, when you read these things, a lot of us misunderstand that on Yom Kippur, there's a Holocaust offering, which sort of the whole thing's incinerated. That's really rare. Normally what happens is you slay the animal, you return the life to the earth by pouring its blood out, you burn the fat, which you weren't going to eat anyway, and then you eat the animal. So you make the sacrifice, you kill this animal, you put it on the altar, and then you eat from God's table. So altar and God's table always go together, that when you make a sacrifice, God nourishes you in return from the table. The other thing we don't always get, right, is on Yom Kippur, the biggest thing is not the Holocaust, it's when the priest lays their hands on the head of the goat and drives the goat out. That's where the sin goes, it leaves. You don't kill the sin, you exile it. You say you have no part in us anymore. I'm talking too much already. So may I ask, Herb, what are you thinking from these readings?
Well, there are these very detailed and prescriptive guidelines or rules for how they're going to build the tabernacle or clothe the priest or whatever else. And at one point I thought, well, you know, maybe they're just leaving the plan for how to build other tabernacles, but they don't build other. There's only one tabernacle, you know, for maybe 2,000 or 3,000 years, I think. Synagogues didn't come until much later, maybe even after the time of Christ. Is that correct? I'm trying to remember.
Yeah, we think maybe there were some synagogues, like prototypical synagogues, happening around the time of Jesus. And remember when we went to Migdal or Magdala, we discovered there was this meeting place that had a place where Torah was read. We're not quite sure like what happened at synagogues other than Torah study, like where's their corporate prayer and singing? You know, we certainly get that by 100 of our common era, but like how far back we push that is unclear. Like were synagogues just a place where you did Talmud Torah, study of Torah, or did you do corporate prayers and stuff like that? Again, we know from 100 on that happened because the temple was destroyed and they had to do something else. But praying outside the temple is a little bit questionable.
Yeah. So it's not like they're leaving the template for how to build others. So it's just they felt the need to record all this information. So, you know, it was kind of interesting. Also, when they described the tax that they put on the people, I think one becca or something they called it, which is a half a shekel. If you do the math on that, and they talk about the number of people that are taxed at one becca, and then how much that raised, how many talents and shekels, if you do the math, it comes out exactly right. What 100 talents and so many shekels, which matched the number of people that got taxed. So I found that kind of interesting. It reminded me of a place, I think in Kings, where they talked about the tabernacle again, and they were building something that was round, and I don't remember what it was. And they described the circumference of it.
Yes.
And they said, or the diameter of it. And then they said the circumference is 3 times that, which is exactly, well, not exactly. They knew the number pi, maybe without knowing it, because the circumference is, 3.14 times the diameter. So their math was a little, I'm speaking like an engineer here, was pretty far along, in some ways. So it's interesting.
I do want to raise to you on that point, though, that when you say pi is 3 instead of 3.14, that dramatically affects your measurements. Now, it is true that if you settle at pi 3.1415, stop there, and you calculate this, like the circumference of the Earth, just with those 4 digits, as opposed to infinitely repeating, it makes a difference of like 4 feet. But when you stop at 3, it makes a really big difference, right? So, like I've heard people try to do some like incredible massage with this and say like, oh, that 3 represents the inner rim, not the outer rim. And that's just silly. It's just silly. And this is a good reminder. This is not a science book. 3 is much more appealing symbolically than 3.1415. So it's just, again, like I think to our own detriment, we take this so literally, we forget to take it seriously.
Good point. Yes. So I found it interesting. I had to look up to remind myself what an ephod was, and kind of a breastplate with gold and intertwined in the threads and jewels and things like that. So there's a lot of detail in here.
Thank you. Herb, you want to invite our next person?
Darlene, do you want to say something?
Sure. I had a little bit of discomfort with the video when about the passing presence of God. I was glad when he said that God didn't completely go away, but that we had to open ourselves to God's presence. That makes it a little more comfortable for me. But honestly, for me, my concept of God is that he's there. God is there, no matter whether we're aware of it or not, or whether we are opening ourselves to God. I think it's just our awareness. Our openness allows us to be aware of God's presence. That's just my personal theology. It may stink, but that's what I struggled with in the video.
I hope it's okay to speak to, last week we talked about how Moses talks to God face to face. And then it says, nobody can see God's face and live. So Moses looks at God's back. But Moses had talked to God face to face. And so like, I think there is this like tension and ambiguity. And most rabbinical interpreters say that Moses can only see God's back because God's going in front of us. So like we're invited to follow. And it's not like a symbol of absence, although you do get sometimes where God tells people like, hey, I'm not traveling with you because I'll kill you all. Right. So like there's this like robustness about how like God's presence is complicated, and like all of the above seems great. And of course, if God is omnipresent, right, then God is going in front of us. God is also going backward to redeem where we've been. And of course, God is more present in ourselves than we are. And I think you can say, yes, yes, yes.
do I need to call on someone?
If you're willing.
Sure. Have Jane. Good morning.
I've been through several courses or studies where we talked about the temple and building the temple and the ark. But through those, until I saw the video today, I've never realized that there wasn't a floor, that it was on sand. And so the priests and the people's feet were in the sand. And that just struck me. I like that concept. I like how it spoke to me. And the idea of, throughout all of this, this study is God's abiding presence. And that has been something that sometimes I need to be reminded of. But I loved the priests and the people's feet in the sand. And the detail, just every time I read this part, the detail is just phenomenal. Just phenomenal to me. And then, of course, I always have to play Indiana Jones in the back of my mind. Then we get to the ark.
Okay, but I can't help myself but interject.
I know.
The ark looks wrong. First, it always has to have poles in it. Those are permanent, right? So you can't take the poles out. Second, cherubim are not humanoid.
No.
They're bizarre, right? They have the faces of the eagle, the ox, the lion, and a human being, and they're covered with eyeballs, and they have 3 pairs of wings. There's a reason we don't have cherubim iconography in church. It's disturbing and grotesque. So when you look at that thing in the Raiders of the Lost Ark, most people think that's how it looked.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a big no. And the other thing people forget is this is not God's seat. It's God's footstool, which meant in the perception of the day, God stood on the box. And when people carried the ark into battle, God is like a giant standing on this box. How tall is God? About 40 feet tall, because that's how tall the temple ends up being.
When I was reading, and they were in the Good News Bible, it paints that picture of this, not the way they worded it. It was not a seat. It was so God can be above us and be present. And I remembered you had mentioned that it was not a seat, it was a footstool. And they made it, the translators made it more like that than a seat.
It's funny because the scripture will talk about the mercy seat, which is the place between the 2 cherubim. And that's like where mercy sits, but mercy sits at God's feet.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if you've read this, there's this bit in Samuel where the ark gets taken by the Philistines and they put it in the temple of Dagon. And the next day, like, Dagon's head is missing. And it's really clear from this imagery that common folk thought that God was like a giant, like 30 feet tall, and Dagon was like a giant, and they had a wrestling match and Dagon lost his head. I mean, like, that's just like sort of the imagery. Now most of us think like, hey, the ark is a symbolic thing and God sits on it, or it's just representative, but it seems pretty clear in the ancient mind that God is 30 feet tall and like actively goes into battle with these other gods and just happens to like be better at that than they are. And that's where the dimensions are important. Like
Mhm.
there's some symbolism, but also you start to realize, wow, like the God of the universe or the God of their land is like 30 feet tall. Like our sanctuary is bigger than the first temple built by Solomon. I mean, just to be clear. Can I ask you about the ground? Would it be weird if I took my shoes off at communion?
No, not to me.
I've kind of wanted to do it for a long time, but the mechanics of it seem like they could be distracting. One of my favorite days of the year is on Maundy Thursday when everybody kind of does that. And I like to leave my shoes off after that point and not put them back on because of this idea about, well, I think of it as vulnerability and connection.
I think that would be kind of cool if you and you could take your shoes off as you while you're preparing the table and the choir is singing. And
Earlier, I thought you were going to make foot washing a sacrament too, but
You know, in the Moravian tradition, it is.
oh, is it? Okay.
Yeah. And the Moravians, we're in full communion with them. And they haven't required that we recognize that as a sacrament in order to be in full communion. I'm intervening too much. I'm sorry. I'll keep my mouth quiet till it's my turn. Thank you, Jane, for putting up with me.
no. I'll pick Graciela or Tom, whichever one wants to talk.
Oh, what I thought about it, listening to you guys, listening to all of you talking, because in some ways, I must say, as a Catholic, you know a lot more than I learned as a Catholic. We're strictly about certain things, as you well know. So I love listening to all of the different things that you need to say about how your beliefs react or respond. The washing of the feet, yeah. We do that on Holy Thursday.
Yeah.
I love that. I've always liked that. One time I was chosen at St. Bernadette's to have my feet washed, and it was just a really special. One of the priests washed my feet. So that's all I can say really, but that's my thought.
The thing that struck me is that I'm amazed at the detail when you know that it was all an oral tradition at that time, that the amount of detail still existed. That is what struck me. The other thing is when you get to the dimensions of the temple and you understand that there's an altar and that type of stuff, how were they able to take it down and to be moving the temple, because they didn't have horses, they didn't have camels. That's just, I was just wondering that's all. John?
Yes, good morning, all. I've got a few things. I think that when we speak about the temple, the whole objective, I think, of the design and building of the temple was to ensure that it could be moved, because they were going to be moving on a fairly regular basis. So I think I remember that God said, "Do not build me anything permanent." He said, "Make it such that it can be moved." And then, as Mike said just a couple of minutes ago, Solomon went ahead and built him a permanent temple. at one point, which is not what God wanted him to do or the Israelites to do. I think another thing that's very interesting about this, and I was trying to quickly go back to the passage, but I couldn't get there fast enough, was that when it came to building the temple, God asked the people for the temple materials. He didn't demand it. And people who were willing, it was a free will offering. People who were willing provided the temple materials. And at the end, Moses had to say, whoa, we got enough. We got enough. We don't need any more. So I think that I agree with something I read in our readings, that he didn't intend to bankrupt the people. He just, through free will, asked them to provide what was needed for the temple. That's kind of what I thought was interesting about it, the fact that he didn't, or she didn't require that the Israelites provide. It was a gift, one way, not. I guess if it was transactional, it was that if you do this, I will be your God, or I will provide you or continue to lead you to the promised land. But in general, the building of the temple, because it was done. I don't want to necessarily say pretty quickly, but over a fairly short period of time, the building of the temple, gosh, I forgot my train of thought there. I'm sorry. Anyway, that's all I have to say. Oh, I do have one question, Mike. So Aaron and his sons were designated the priests, and they were of the clan, if you will, Levi. So they were the priestly clan. And when did priests in the Hebrew tradition become rabbis? Or did that not at all happen? That's all I got. Thanks.
Is it okay if I invite Ellen?
Ellen, would you like to go ahead?
I don't have a lot to say today. I've been kind of out of it this week. But the word sanctuary is something that I really have had in my mind. And it seems to me that we as people need a space, a sacred space, a sanctuary, particularly in moments of great distress or great thankfulness. And I know for myself, there have been times in my life where I had to go to the church. I was just drawn to the physical church. And there I could express everything that I was feeling, could get angry, scream, God, why? And feel safe. And so I've just carried sanctuary with me this week. And that's kind of like where I've been. So Mary, are you there? Don't know.
Well, we can always go back. We'll go in another try. Hey, I want to do my best with what you asked. When do rabbis show up? After the destruction of the Jerusalem temple, or maybe, John, maybe after the Babylonian exile, because not everybody wanted to go back to the Levant, to Palestine. So maybe there's some rabbis doing this study of the Torah. And but that starts to become more like it is now after the temple's destroyed. So you got people doing textual study, maybe 540 before the Common Era, that's BCE. But
What's the
like
first temple?
the
Not
first
the
temple
second.
got built. Yeah. So remember the first temple built sometime around 940, destroyed, burned to the ground in 586. They built another temple sometime around 520. It's a soft date. That one lasts a long time. Herod the Great builds it up, like turns it from a hovel to a wonder of the world. That one gets razed to the ground in the year 70 of the Common Era, that's AD. And obviously there's not a third temple.
But you're saying that the if you will, I don't want to misuse this, but the transition, if you will, from priest to rabbi took place after the destruction of the first temple. Maybe. I mean, I know it's not exact, but
You start seeing like rabbinate that is like teaching disciples how to study the Torah, but they're not doing priestly functions. And priestly functions kind of go away after the temple is destroyed because there's nowhere to do it. And that's when the rabbi sort of eclipses the priest. Now, you know, if somebody Jewish is in the Levitical tradition or the Aaronic tradition, if they have the last name Cohen. Cohen means priest in Hebrew, Kohen, right? And so those would be the descendants of Aaron. But, you know, I don't know anybody named Cohen that is like slaughtering animals and burning fat on an altar. I just, in general, our Jewish brothers and sisters don't do that anymore. What they've decided, by and large, is that studying about sacrifice is as good as doing it. It is this great thing. We're hearing about the tabernacle, right? This is way ahead of the temple, which is kind of this like moving sanctuary, which is clear. These are nomadic shepherds, right? So they're moving too often. And then this is a reminder, hey, God's all around the land and not centralized. David centralizes the government into a capital and centralizes Jerusalem into the place. And that's different from this. There is this injunction, don't build an altar for me out of mortared stones, but then we get to hear in Exodus, build an altar. So it's a little bit funny. A lot of folk don't realize apparently that the weave of that curtain that shrouds the Holy of Holies apparently was like so strong, it would take teams of oxen pulling opposite to tear it. So when you read in the Gospel of Mark that it's torn from top to bottom, that's a feat. Symbolic. A lot of people don't realize that the ark is visited once a year by the high priest, and apparently the story is the high priest had a rope on his ankle with a bell on it because they often were struck dead. And if you went in to retrieve the body, you'd die too. So you have to yank the dead priest out because they didn't do something right. So like, this is a really big deal. And it's helpful to think about like, what is the nature of holiness? Is holiness detrimental to you? We want to treat things with awe and wonder and respect, right? But can it hurt you? And this is a conversation we continue to have, right? Like, should you take the Eucharist if you're not in like a pure spirit, or if you haven't been baptized? And I'm on the other side of that conversation, just to be honest. And I also find myself thinking we should treat this space that we designate sanctuary better than we treat our own homes. So I'm a little all over the map, you know. I don't want us to lose the detail that ancient altars had horns on them. A horn is like a spike that comes up on each corner. We don't have those anymore, and nobody knows why they had them. They are a symbol of the strength of the altar or the table. Sometimes you say, like you read this later, when people want to claim sanctuary, they'll grab the horns of the altar. And you're not supposed to touch somebody when they're grabbing the horns of the altar. Now, again, our Lord's table doesn't have horns. We quit that practice a long, long time ago. And nobody quite knows like exactly what it means in ancient speak, but we do know they represented the strength of the table, and that all of these altars had horns on them. And really do think about like bull horns coming out the corners. But they didn't like subdue an animal with these horns. They didn't impale an animal on them. They just were this like feature. All we can do is conjecture why they had that stuff. Julia asked a question about Aaron carrying stuff on his breastplate. So the question, I want to make sure I read it instead of just going off memory because I'm going to butcher it. She asked me in Exodus 28:30, and I'll read this. It says, finally put the Urim and Thummim into the breastpiece of judgment, and they'll be over Aaron's heart when he enters the presence of the Lord. So Aaron will bear these symbols of judgment upon the sons of Israel over his heart constantly before the Lord. The question is, what does that mean? And just remember that the Urim and Thummim are lots or dice. They're symbols of judgment because you roll to discern God's will instead of using your best thinking. It may sound silly, but it's actually a pretty interesting practice to think about. They sort of say, hey, we've done our best thinking, and now we're just going to roll the dice because we can talk ourselves into anything we want. I have some admiration for the practice, actually, even though I know it could be silly. But, you know, you can like hold this space that if you really don't know between two directions, why not say God direct the coin? I mean, you know, like, I'm not sure that's silly.
Mike, I guess I'm a little cynical in that by rolling the dice, it takes the responsibility off of your shoulders and puts it on God, if you will.
That's great. Wouldn't you love God to be responsible for the decision you're getting ready to make? Now, I'll tell you, when I went to go to college, I had this in mind, and there were two schools that were going to give me full tuition scholarships, right? And I said, all right, I don't know how to pick. I'm going to flip a coin. But after I flipped that coin, I said, well, let's make that 2 out of 3. And that revealed what I really wanted, you know? And to be honest, who knows what would have happened if I'd gone on flip 1, because the school that won was the one I did not go to. So what I did was 2 out of 3, and then I did that 2 out of 3 times. And that's just disingenuous, you know, like that's like pretending to follow this. I mean, like the way I think it has to work is you just sort of say, I'm stuck between 2 good choices and I don't know how to pick. I don't think it's a bad practice. If you're okay with either choice, flip away. And then you can say, God, I don't know if you influenced the coin, but I'm going to choose to believe you could have. We don't do this at vestry meetings, in case you're wondering. Well, I suppose we could. One other thing that Julia mentioned, and I think this is really interesting, is to think about how much preparation it takes to make a sanctuary be a place where we feel this presence and thought. You know, in the book we read, the Native American book we read, you know, you have to make a cornmeal circle and you have to be oriented in such a way, and there's ways you prepare for a vision. And I think part of the reason we do this preparation is not because God needs that stuff, but so that we can recognize the sacrality of the space, right? And this is what our altar guild does. And most people don't know how much prep the altar guild does. And they don't recognize that, hey, like all that ironing that has to happen of linen, which is terrible to iron, I happen to know. And not just because I'm bad at ironing. It's just linen's tough to work with. And it has to be linen because it's natural. And it's in the Bible. That's what they used, right? They do all this work quietly and invisibly so that people can come in and see something that's not ramshackle, but that is orderly and neat. And not everybody thinks, wow, it took a lot of time to get the frontal lined up in such a way, or to refill those candles, you know? And so this is this quiet ministry where people get to come in and see a bunch of preparation they didn't even know about that makes the place inviting and stand out. And I do think that's beneficial to us, that we have to sometimes we stumble into sacred places. Like I've walked into thin places before while traveling. But if a place is going to be a place I continue to return to, the investment helps me. The preparation helps me. I think we can all admit church isn't always like a holy experience. There's sometimes where I'm just thinking about grocery shopping or I'm just not feeling it. But I do sort of think the more preparation and practice we do, the more we put ourselves in a posture to have those moments that we otherwise might miss. I don't know if that makes sense. I don't always feel great every time I pray, but I know if I only prayed when I felt great, I'd pray a lot less. Some of you all know that our Mormon brothers and sisters wear holy underwear. And these are garments they don't ever take off, really. I'm not quite sure how they shower. I mean, they do shower, but they have like an extra set or they wash around it so that they don't take this holy underwear off. And that comes out of this. The holy underwear has like pomegranates and gourds embroidered on it, just like these vestments would have had. I don't know if you noticed, there's a patent on anointing oil and incense. And if you copy that patent, you die. I don't know if you saw that. There's only one kind of incense you can be burning in the sanctuary. And if you burn that at home, you're going to die for that. Of course, we don't know if that ever got carried out, but you see behind that rule is this way to say, this is really going to be a special place. It's going to smell different. People are going to dress differently. The priests are going to eat different food. They're going to eat bread that sat by the ark. Now you might be thinking, didn't people have to carry that in? Nope, you can just put that in with a pizza, with a you know, like a pizza shovel, and you can pizza shovel that bread out and you eat it. And then you've got like, oh God, like the clergy are eating food that's been in God's like real physical presence. So they've got this nourishment to do this special stuff in this special place. Of course, that's all for us. But I do think it speaks to a need that we have. We'd like to know physically that this is different. That's why we have a piscina in the sacristy. A piscina is a pipe that goes straight into the ground, doesn't go into the sewer. We don't use it much here because I usually drink the wine. When there's any left in the cup, we put water in it and we swirl it, and I drink that too. Because if I use the piscina, I have to clean it. But if I do what I told you with the cup, all of it's been consumed. And the reason we have our own sink is so, and most people don't even know this, is so that we can practice respecting these elements. We don't do anything like treat them like common things. That's the point.
Mike,
Yes, sir.
it did mention, I think it was in here, that, was it here? Anyway, when the Israelites moved from the wilderness across the Jordan into, quote, the promised land, the Jordan had been raging. And as soon as they approached the Jordan, it calmed down and it parted, and they were able to walk across into the promised land.
Yes.
So that was, you know, whether it be real or symbolic, something similar to moving from Egypt into the wilderness. Then we have the Israelites moving from the wilderness back into I guess, the promised land. And I guess coming back to the tabernacle, once they moved into the promised land, they I'm guessing, could establish a location for the tabernacle and not have to move it again. Does that make sense?
Yes, but theoretically, they didn't do that. According to the text, they made these. This is super weird. You're supposed to move this tabernacle and not have sanctuaries, but there are sanctuaries at Bethel, Dan, and Shiloh. So from the get-go, there's the imperative, don't do that. And they did that. And then they said those are places where God dwells, which was against the instructions. And so, like, it's interesting to think they don't follow their own principles. And I think that actually comes back to empathetically, like, Darlene, what you were saying about, like, well, is God ahead of us, or is God here or backward? And the answer is probably yes. So we could say, like, oh, look, these don't agree with each other. One's right, one's wrong. Or we could say, hey, the truth is so big that no one way is going to cover it. Now, we have a sanctuary here, to be honest, because it's convenient. And because it meets our needs of having a place that's set apart where you can go to do special things. I mean, that's what I think. And the temple spoke to that need. Now, if we only had one, if you had to go to the National Cathedral for Christmas, you wouldn't do it every year. And that's why we've got localized versions, right? And what we get is, hey, the local version actually probably speaks to my regular need more than going to Jerusalem once in my life. The two things are both really cool, but since I live locally, I'd like to be able to worship and interact locally. And when I do this other thing, it's a neat one-off or a 10-off, but I'm not going to base my spiritual life on having to travel 3,000 miles. Because, boy, there'd be long stretches in between that.
Mike, the architecture of the church has the chancel, right? Which is where the altar is. And then it's also got the nave, which is where the people are. How did we go from, even if we did, how did we go from the tabernacle to this layout that we see today? I mean, they're similar, I get it, but still, I'd like to hear a little bit more about that.
So that's, and John, I'm not going to be definitive, but I'm going to tell you my understanding of it. So for one thing, right, churches are built like upside down boat hulls, hull, H-U-L-L, because the church is the ship of salvation. So when you look up in our rafters, it's an upside down boat. And actually Brumley Hall, the architecture was to extend that out into the hallway. This is carrying you somewhere. The chancel is elevated so that we realize it's elevated. And the way we did this when we laid tile, we picked a different tile on purpose to show that something different happens up there. All of this is symbolic, and it's to help us drill down into what's going on. Is God more present in the chancel than in any of the pews? No. If you're omnipresent, in my mind, you have to be equally distributed. Just logically. If you're everywhere at the same time, you can't be more in place X than place Y. You're just in both of those places. But I think our need is to say what's happening up there has an extra layer of gravity to it. And that's why we place it up to draw our eye up, because up is one of those European directions, Indo-European directions that we associate with holiness. There are a few folks who look down for holiness, but we tend to look up, right? And so it lifts our eye up to the Lord's table. It lifts our eye up to the light coming in the window. And all of this is to help us appreciate the gravity. These symbols are ways to say, this is special, don't miss this. Well, that's what I think anyway. Mary, if you're still there, it's not too late. But if you got to go, we get it.
No, y'all, this has been such a crazy morning. If it's already been talked about, y'all just say, oh, it's there. But Julia, actually, she's so sweet. She sent me another question. She's like, oh, if you have time to talk about this.
Yeah.
But she was asking about in Exodus chapter 32, with the golden calf, and then God talking to Moses and telling him he will let his wrath burn hot. Did y'all talk about this?
No.
Okay, good. I know Julie's like, I'm like, wow, Julia, she's having all the good question. And then God talking to Moses and telling him he will let his wrath burn hot against the people and consume them. But of you, I will make a great nation. And then Moses talks God off the ledge, and then God repents of the evil. So she says, lots of thoughts here. I don't know what to make of them. I'm not sure, but it's just not the first time that God has repented in the Hebrew Bible. Is this the first time that a human has talked him off the ledge? What does this mean that Moses can do this? Is it that God listens? And then also right after Moses does this, he goes down the mountain and then orders half the people to be slayed. And then God sends a plague. Is this a warning that if you don't follow God, bad things will happen to you? Was it a scare tactic? Celia, love her.
I don't have a definitive answer in the mind of the people who wrote this text.
Okay.
Right. But here's a clear thing. If you took this literally, prayer has the power to change God's mind. Now, it happens a few times in the scriptures. Abraham haggles with God like a Middle Eastern swap meet, right? I actually am not a fan of the practice. I will say probably what I need to argue are with my conceptions of God instead of who God really is. I personally have a hard time worshiping a God who would commit genocide over something like this because I know not to do that, right? If I, as a person with all my frailties, know better than to wipe out an entire people group in my anger, surely God knows better than I do. And look how Moses prays, God, this would damage your reputation. I mean, that's basically what he doesn't say, God, you're better than this. Moses says, God, you know, you're going to have a hard time attracting followers if you act like this. So I all the mystical people I've read say we don't pray to change God's mind, we pray to change our own. That's been my experience with the most powerful prayers, is not that I tricked God into doing my agenda, but that I left changed. But I will tell you, intercessory prayer tends to be like what people think of. Like if you say to me, like, hey, my aunt is sick, I want you to pray for her. I think most people hear that as, hey, God, you got to help Mary's aunt. I mean, does God really work like that? To me, it's a good question to ask, but that's the model we mostly have settled into, is like, hey, we need to bug God into doing what's beneficial for people we love until it happens. That just seems, I mean, again, like, I don't even have to beg my spouse to do something for me. Like my spouse, when attentive, just does stuff, you know, like, so I you know, it's a little bit troubling for me. I just have to be honest, you know. And again, the reason God changes God's mind is because about God's reputation, not like God's inherent goodness. What I appreciate, and here I'm going to a lesser authority source, the Psalms. There's a few Psalms that say, God, forgive us, not because we deserve it, but because of who you are. That's a spirituality that's attractive to me. Now, I will say, Mary, it's really fair for me, again, that I have had prayers in which I've argued with my own conceptions of God and God's presence. Like, God, why on earth is this happening? I think that's really fair. And I think it's most fair if I'm open to being transformed. But if I go with a list of demands and God better meet my demands, I'm going to be constantly disappointed in my own spirituality.
So Mike, when you prayed, why on earth, God, why on earth is this happening? Have you reached?
Usually the
gotten an
conclusion,
answer?
yeah, usually the conclusion I get, John, is that God is asking me that same question. There's this little cartoon, right, where there's a guy on a bench and there's Jesus, and this guy says, Jesus, I just don't understand why you allow children to starve and why you allow, systemic racism to exist. And Jesus replies, I was going to ask you the same question, and I think that's this sort of holy conversation, because the truth is, sometimes I like to think I'm not a fatalist, but sometimes I'm surprised to find myself thinking those ways. Oh, this is happening for a reason. Well, probably the most immediate reason is somebody was doing the best with what they had and they didn't have very much. That somebody could have been me. Mary, I don't know if that's really helpful. The golden calf incident, though, it's tough, right? It's tough. And it's particularly tough, right? Because Aaron blames the people, blames the fire. He was behind all that stuff. And the text is really clear. And Aaron doesn't get punished at all. That's not just, but it does describe how we act. So I think sometimes, again, like we read the Bible prescriptively to our own peril, when really this might be describing us. Now, I'm not saying anything bad about intercessory prayer. I'm just sort of saying I'm not convinced that that's like the only way to pray. And I think when that's our model of what prayer is, it frankly limits what prayer can be. I've tried to grow into this idea that prayer is just any time I'm aware of God's presence in the room. And I might not have to say anything. Sometimes I pray when I have a monologue with myself, like I'm not sure I'm living into my values. I'm really sure when I distribute food that that's a prayer. I'm really sure when I practice loving, practice it and not just feel like it, I'm really sure that's prayer. But I don't know what to make of this story.
Well, I think it's a harder story to take if you're a literalist and think every word in there is from the hand of God. Yeah. And I tend to see this as men inspired by God who were writing this down. And of course, we all exhibit selfish sort of tendencies to put ourselves, Moses, I saved the people from God, but it's difficult, no doubt about it. And I just am amazed that Abraham and Moses even argue as God, it's argue as God. So, but I tend to see some humanness in the story.
And it's this weird thing that's happened to us as Christian folk in the last 100 years. I mean, Jewish people disagree about this stuff all the time. Like one of the most Jewish things to do is to get together and disagree about what this means and what the intention was. And then you come back again instead of, well, you didn't say what I like, so I'm taking my toys and going home. As Christians do that. Jewish people say there's something really great about us disagreeing. And when you read rabbinic commentary, they intentionally put oppositional viewpoints together and don't say which one's right, because they think there's something really nice about there being options and like us trying to figure out how we can understand and live into this, right? And so like a monolithic read is a new idea, not an old one. It's one that's unfortunately dominated most like Christian expressions in the West. I'd love to go backward and say like, hey, we don't all have to be of the same mind. Now we are going to treat each other well, but you can disagree about all the other stuff and like, that's fine.
Or you can just be happy.
Okay.
Sorry.
No, hers.
Or you can just be happy that we live in New Testament times with a loving God,
But I just have to say, like, that dispensationalist read that like God changed the deal. It's anti-Semitic. I mean, this is not the Old Testament. It's the Hebrew Bible, right? I mean, this is like our scriptures. And I think when we say like, oh, well, God is now graceful and God used to be legalistic, that says more about us than it says about God. I mean, did God have to grow up? Or has God always been inherently good?
Well, I think we did grow up, but he had to manifest himself in different ways at different times because of, let's say, maturity of the human race.
So it's interesting to think that God will work with cultural understandings, even if they're not the best. To me, that's an interesting thought, and it was one of the big hiccups in the missionary movement. It was like, when you go to Africa, do you have to convert people to Western values first to make them a Christian? Do people have to give up their multiple wives? Because that's a thing, right? Do they have to give that up because that's how we live? Or, right, is there recognition that like God is big enough to work through different cultures as they are?
Yeah.
We struggle with it. I mean, we do. We struggle with it. A lot of people say like polygamy is from the devil. Well, okay, fine. But if you tell somebody in Africa you have to get rid of all but one wife, the other ones are going to become prostitutes or slaves. That's not very gracious. So until you change the practice like slowly and thoughtfully and carefully, you put a lot of people in collateral damage.
Y'all, I have to hop off, but I wanted to say something that was, I actually heard this. Our conservative church got a new pastor, and I met with him because he's actually been a friend with me for a very long time. And he said something to me that I was like, thank you. But he said, the only thing I know that's true about my theology is that I'm wrong about something. And I love that. And it was so refreshing to hear just the way that was phrased. And he said, you better bet that I'm going to put confidence, like once I've gotten to a point on something, I'm going to be confident about it. And sort of like that, like you were saying, the Jews, how they debate about it and like, no, it's got to be this way or whatever. But just that was an encouragement to me that he is pastoring this very conservative, church that I'm not sure I'm going to go back to, but that he said that. He's like, I know the only thing that's true about my theology is that I've got something wrong. And I love to hear that he's living in that gray as well. So, okay, but I got to hop off, y'all. Good to see y'all.
Hey, so my favorite quote from Gregory of Nazianzus, he's a mystic, Orthodox thinker in 400s. He said, concepts create idols, only wonder really knows.
Oh,
and I really appreciate that. It would be a great return. Thanks for your time. I just want to cast. I want to change the order of the book a little bit. Next week is called Gospel, and it's like a survey. I want to do it at the end, not the beginning. So what I want us to do for next week are actually lessons 18 and 19. 19 is more thought about prayer, which relates really well to what we did today. And 18 is text-based chronologically in Luke. Okay, I'll send an email. 18 and 19. We'll come back to 17 at the end of Luke, if that makes sense, because I want to do the overview after we've read the stuff instead of at the beginning. Thank you for your time. I'm grateful you put up with me, and I hope this is uplifting for you. And I just appreciate time with you. And it's the atmosphere in the world is tough, and I'm grateful to have this time with you.
Mike?
Yes, sir.
Just a second before you go.
Okay. Let me hit stop recording.